through 75. Have you ever had somebody that you knew was your friend in a certain setting of people, but outside of that setting of people, they acted like they didn't know you? I remember one time I went to school or I went to church with some kids, and they were part of my youth group, and of course we all went to different middle schools or junior highs back then. And we had a great group of kids. I mean, we liked to do things together at church. We were good buddies. But then when we got to high school, it's like some of them didn't want anybody else to know that they went to church with me. Because I was from a little country school, and they were from a bigger school. And then they didn't really want people to know that they even went to church, it seemed like. Two different circles. Being two people in two different settings. And it doesn't just happen in school with kids. It happens as adults. Sometimes, I won't ask you if you've been guilty of it, but you see somebody from a long way off in the grocery store or Walmart, and you're like, no, go down the next aisle just so you won't have to talk to them. Yeah. Kind of an act of betrayal sometimes, or denying that we know somebody. That's kind of what we're going to focus on today. Now, Jesus had predicted that Peter was going to deny him 3 times before the night was over, before the rooster crowed. Even as Jesus said it, we look at Peter's life and we have a hard time believing that. I mean, the way that we see Peter in the garden with Jesus, draw his sword and stand in front of Jesus and say, no, you got to get through me before you're going to get to Jesus. It's kind of hard to wrap your mind around how so quickly Peter might deny Jesus. I mean, Peter was the one when Jesus said, who do you say I am? And he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. This is a staggering account that we're going to look at today. And what makes it even more staggering is that if we stop and think about our own lives, what would we do in a similar situation? Or even more troubling is to think about the ways that we deny Jesus every day without even thinking about it. So let's kind of set the scene before we read our passage. Jesus has been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. There was that whole uproar, and Jesus said, enough, put that sword away. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. You know, Judas, do what you come to do quickly. He's betrayed by a kiss. They put him in chains and they drag him off. They take him to the house of the high priest. Now, this wasn't just like the average person's house. This was like a walled compound. And the purpose of taking Jesus here was to kind of hide him away from people until they could get enough incriminating evidence that they could charge him with something they could execute him for. And we're told that all the disciples deserted Jesus, but Peter and one more disciple, likely John, followed at a distance behind this mob that had come to get Jesus. And the Gospel of John tells us that Peter got into the compound because the other disciple knew the high priest and was granted entry. Now, most people believe this other disciple was John because he doesn't ever call himself by name in his writing, but we really don't know for sure. Whoever it is, apparently they were a family friend of the high priest, and we don't know what happened with that other disciple, because this is focused on Peter. And that's where we pick up the story. Let's look at verses 69 through 75. I can get my glasses on here. Meanwhile, Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came over and said to him, "You're one of those with Jesus the Galilean." But Peter denied it in front of everyone. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Later, out by the gate, another servant girl noticed him and said to those standing around, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again, Peter denied it, this time with an oath. "I don't even know the man," he said. A little later, some of the other bystanders came over to Peter and said, You must be one of them. We can tell by your Galilean accent. Peter swore, a curse on me if I'm lying. I don't know the man. And immediately the rooster crowed. Suddenly, Jesus' words flashed through Peter's mind. Before the rooster crows, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. And Peter went away, weeping bitterly. So there's really no doubt that Peter loved Jesus. I mean, like I said, he drew his sword to protect Jesus in the garden out of love for him. I mean, he follows Jesus into the courtyard, I think because he wanted to show support. And he wanted to let Jesus know that he was loved. But Peter, unfortunately, is recognized. Not once, but 3 times. The first time, the servant girl was probably just making a simple observation. We don't know that her words were an accusation. But Peter quickly denied any association with Jesus. And it happened 2 more times. Each time his denial became stronger. The 3rd time, Peter called a curse on himself. Now, if you take it back to the Greek word that's translated as curse here is related to the Greek word anathema, which means damnation. So Peter essentially was pronouncing a curse on those who associated him with Jesus. He is saying that his accusers deserved to be damned. He unleashed a torrent of verbal abuse at the suggestion that he was a follower of Christ, insisting that he did not know Jesus. Now, if you look over in Luke chapter 22, we see that at that moment the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Suddenly the Lord's words flashed through Peter's mind. Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. And Peter left the courtyard weeping bitterly. What an awful moment that must have been for Peter. It's like, you can see it play out. It's likely that Jesus is in this big walled compound and there's no way that he can hear what Peter's saying, but as soon as Peter says it, Jesus turns and looks him in the eye from the window. After all that Jesus had done for him, after all of Peter's boast of loyalty, how could he so easily have denied even knowing Jesus? And frankly, we're kind of stunned by how easily Peter failed. He quickly, and without really even thinking, he protected himself, even though it meant denying his Lord. I mean, this was Peter. This was one of the inner 3 of the disciples. This was a man that walked on water with Jesus. He was with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. If it was so easy for Peter to deny Jesus, what about us? James Boyce, in his commentary, he writes, Peter did fail, and his failure is a lesson for us. Peter was the apparent leader of the disciples. If this had been Nicodemus, we wouldn't be surprised, because Nicodemus was always being afraid of what other people might think. If this had been the rich young ruler, we wouldn't be surprised, because we know he loved his possessions above everything. We wouldn't be surprised if this had been one who never confessed Jesus openly. Yet this wasn't Nicodemus or the rich young ruler or some weak follower. This was Peter. And he fell with such slight provocation. He collapsed before the question of a mere servant girl. If Peter could do that, so can we. What happened to Peter can happen to the strongest of us. And it may even be the strongest of us who are in the greatest danger. So, it's very wise for us to see our own vulnerability. And I want to look at Peter's actions and maybe break it down a little bit and see what Peter did, his mistakes along the way that led to his denying Christ. The first thing that I see is that through all of this, Peter did not heed the Lord's warnings. I mean, time and time again, Jesus had warned the disciples. He told them, you're going to deny me. Instead of listening to Jesus, or instead of better asking, Jesus, Lord, how can I keep that from happening? How can I stay strong? But what did Peter do? He told Jesus he was wrong. Never, not me. These other guys, they might, but not me. When they were in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus warned them. You need to pray, guys, that you won't be tempted. You need to pray because your spirit's willing, but your flesh is weak. Did they pray? No, they went to sleep. And when we think about that, all through the Bible, we are warned about our weakness apart from Christ. In John 15, Jesus plainly says, apart from me, you can do nothing. Nothing. In our own strength, guys, we cannot stand. The Bible in 2 Timothy tells us to study, to show ourselves as workmen who does not need to be ashamed. But do we study like we ought to? No. In Psalm 119, it tells us to hide His Word in our hearts so that we might not sin against God. Do we do that? Not like we should. 1 Thessalonians teaches us to pray without ceasing. How's your prayer life? Mine suffers sometimes. Matthew 6 tells us to seek first the kingdom of God, but what do? We seek everything else, and then we want to give God just a little bit of what's left over, if we got time, if it's not pretty on Sunday, if I don't have something else to do during Bible study. In Proverbs 22, we're told to train up a child in the way that he should go. What happens in our society these days? A lot of children are running their household. They're teaching their parents, not the other way around. In Exodus 20, we're told to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Not doing such a good job with that sometimes. You see, we, like Peter and the other disciples, often we don't listen. These are clear commands from God's Word, and that's just a little sprinkling. There's a multitude of warnings and commands given to us by God. Clear commands that we feel very free to pick and choose or to ignore altogether. So we shouldn't be surprised when life hits us in the face sometimes that we're vulnerable to the temptations of the world. In our arrogance, sometimes we feel like we're smarter or wiser than God is. Or perhaps we think, that was then, this is now. Jesus, you really don't get what I'm going through. But we're told that we have a high priest, unlike any other. He knows exactly what we're doing because He has gone through everything we'll ever encounter. Of course, when we think those ways, we're wrong and foolish, and we need to heed God's warnings. We need to follow His commands. Secondly, we see that, in a way, Peter thinks a little higher of himself than he does other people. Peter had no trouble believing that, hey, you know what, Jesus? Some of these other guys, they probably are going to deny it. Yeah, we know them. But me? No, not me. Never going to happen. Even if I have to die, I'll never deny it. We are prone to look at the failures of other people when we see them weak, and we think, that couldn't be me. And sometimes we even think, if they were a little bit more like me, they wouldn't be in the mess that they're in right now. It might be a relationship problem. It might be a sexual sin. It might be financial distress. It might be a spiritual failure. It might be a problem or being caught up in a lie. It might be a debilitating addiction. It might be a rebellious child. It's easy to look at the problems of other people and conclude that, I don't have those problems because I'm a much stronger Christian than they have ever been. And that is arrogance and that's pride. And those two things put a big smile on the devil's face. Arrogance tends to bring about laziness. And lazy Christians feel like they don't have to study their Bible. They don't have to pray. They don't need accountability. They don't need safeguards put in place in their life because, hey, I've got it all figured out. I'm stronger than they are. It'll never happen. And then in the blink of an eye, it all falls apart. To believe that we are better or stronger or more faithful than others because they're struggling and we're not, that's just foolish and it's very dangerous. When we see one who has fallen, we should realize that, But for the grace of God, that's me. That's me. God calls us to one standard of measure. That's to measure ourselves by His Word. Not by what other people do, how good, or how much they have followed. So we have to keep in mind that our bent towards sin is strong. No matter how strong we think we are, sin will get a hold of us. And we ought to be just like Paul. We ought to know that, because Paul said, hey, the good I want to do, I don't do, and the evil that I don't want to do, I can't keep myself from doing it. And that, in truth, is who we are outside of Jesus Christ. Peter, through this, learned the importance of humbleness, humility. And then finally, we see that Peter, he puts himself in a situation where he is alone in the enemy territory. I used to teach there, and one of the things that I used to tell the kids was ways to say no. And one of the greatest ways to say no is what we call strength in numbers. Surround yourself by people who don't do drugs and who are not drunkards and those types of things, and you'll be less likely to go down that road. Peter walks right into a courtyard of the high priest in the middle of the night when everybody else there wants to kill Jesus. Peter's walking into a lion's den with a pork chop necklace, and it's like he's surprised when he gets attacked. We need to realize, we need to have relationships with non-Christian people, absolutely. How else are they going to know Jesus and see the mercy of God and hear about the gospel unless we tell them and show them? But we've got to be very cautious with the way and in the setting that we do this, because we are just as prone to peer pressure as any teenager has ever been. I want you to think of this illustration. If you are standing on a diving board and the water is beneath you, and there's a person in the water reaching up, and you reach down and grab a hold of their hands, is it easier for you to pull them up or for them to pull you down? You're going in the water. You're going in the water. Peter walked out on the diving board alone, and he got pulled into the pool. It's the same in life most of the time for us. It's easier to pull people down than it is to raise them up. It's a warning about spending too much time in places where you're going to be tempted with sin. If you're an alcoholic, what's the first thing you need to do? Don't go to bars. No. Stay away from people who drink. Right? I had the unfortunate job at the police department when I was in charge of the patrol divisions of discipline. It's never a fun thing to do. And this one officer, young man, young family, good fella, I had to talk to him because I was hearing things on the street about how he was spending time in a certain bar in the next county over. Most of the time, what people do away from their job is their own business, but not in the public's eye. We didn't allow that kind of stuff. So I had to go and talk to him, and I said, hey, I'm hearing a lot of things, you need to be careful, because, first of all, you consider yourself a Christian. You call yourself a Christian. Is it a sin for you to go into that bar? No. But I'm telling you right now, it's diminishing your testimony. The things that I'm hearing, even if it's not true, it's diminishing your testimony. Second of all, you're hurting the image of your employer, this department. We don't uphold those types of settings. I'm sorry. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not even drinking. I'm just going there to be with my friends. It won't happen. A month or so later, I have to have that same talk again with him. This time he says, I can go in a bar and not get drunk. I am an adult. I know what I'm doing. So I wrote him up. 6 weeks later, he's arrested for DWI after getting into a fight and leaving that same bar. He honestly thought that he was stronger than he was. In reality, he was weak. And he was weakened further by others around him. They pulled him down. instead of him lifting them up. Now, I can go on to say that there is a happy ending to that story, that after a couple years of rehab and finding a new job, because it cost him his job, it cost him his career in law enforcement, almost cost him his family, but he, like Peter, confessed, repented, turned, and he was led into ministry. He had a successful pastoralship for several years until he unexpectedly dropped dead in his garage at the age of 42. Yeah. The same thing can happen to any of us. We cannot make the mistake of thinking that we are stronger than anyone else or that we can withstand temptation in any form. Because we're only strong when we are in Christ Jesus. Period. We have no strength on our own. When we place ourselves into tempting situations, we shouldn't be surprised when sin grabs a hold of us. No one wakes up and decides, today is the day I'm going to disgrace my family, I'm going to deny Jesus, and I'm just going to embrace sin. No, nobody does that. It's usually because we have let our guard down and we get pulled in. So it's easy for us to look at Peter and kind of be hard because, he failed. He failed big. And then he left running and went out and wept and cried. But here's the thing. All four of the Gospels record this story. Even though by the time that the Gospels were written, Peter is acknowledged by everyone as being the leader of the church. So that leads us to the question, why draw all this attention to Peter's failure? Could it be that the gospel writers wanted everybody to know that there are no perfect people in the church? Did they want people to see that even the big leader of the church was a sinner? I go to my favorite author, Max Lucado, for this. He says, how did the New Testament writers know of Peter's sin? Who told them of his betrayal? And more importantly, how did they know the details? Who told them of the servant girl at the gate and the soldiers starting the fire? How did Matthew know that it was Peter's accent that gave him away? How did Luke learn of the stare from Jesus? Who told all four of the crowing rooster and the bitter weeping? Somewhere in Jerusalem, in the shadows, Peter quit running. He fell to his knees, buried his face in his hands, and he gave up. But not only did he give up, he opened up. He went back to the room where he had his feet washed by Jesus, and Jesus had broke the bread and shared the wine. And there he is, every burly bit of him filling the doorframe. Fellas, I got something I got to get off my chest. And that's when they learn of the fire and of the girl and of the stare from Jesus. That's when they hear of the cursing mouth and the crowing rooster. That's how they heard the story. Peter turned himself in. How can I be so sure? Because Peter couldn't stay away. When word came that the tomb was empty, who was the first out of the room? Peter. When word came that Jesus was on the shore after the resurrection, who was the first out of the boat? Peter. He was on the run again, but only now he was running in the right direction. Here's a good rule of thumb. Those who keep secrets from God keep their distance from God. Those who are honest with God draw near to God. The point is that God does not expect us to be perfect. Honest people are sincere in seeking the Lord's help. Now, in John chapter 21, we see Jesus and Peter having a talk after all this, after the resurrection. And beginning in verse 15 of John 21, we read, after breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter replied, you know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said, you know I love you. Then take care of my sheep. A third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, then feed my sheep. The first time he asked Peter, Peter, do you still think that you love me all more than the rest of these guys do? He didn't say, you know that I love you more than these guys do. He said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Then he asked him 2 more times. His 3 times of asking, do you love me? Is an undoing of the 3 denials. Each time Jesus tells him to do something. Well, then if you love me, feed my lambs. If you love me, take care of my sheep. If you really love me, then feed my sheep. It reminds us that talking about following is easy, but true following of Jesus requires action on our part. One commentator points out, Peter's life changed when he finally realized who Jesus was. His occupation finally changed from fisherman to evangelist. His identity changed from impetuous to rock solid. And his relationship with Jesus changed from one who denied him to one who was forgiven. In Luke chapter 9, Jesus gives us some sobering words. He said, if anyone is ashamed of me and my message, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he returns in his glory and in the glory of the Father and the holy angels. We have to learn from Peter's failure. We must always remain aware that apart from Christ, we are weak. We need to stay away from situations that might cause us to stumble. And we also need to learn that in those occasions that when we do stumble, when we find ourselves failing miserably, that we are still children of God, and we are before a world that's watching to see what we will do. I believe the world needs to see the children of God fall on their knees and confess and repent. We must face our sin and confess it before the Lord and before anyone else that we have heard in our actions. If Peter can do this, how much more are we weaker than Peter? I mean, the rock. Dave ain't the rock. Sorry, I said ain't, King. Dave's not a rock. I have failures. I have faults. I have weaknesses. So do you. We must learn how to deal with those things in the strength of Christ. It's easy to talk about following Jesus, but it's a whole different challenge to stand with him when the pressure is on. The only way we do that is to remain diligent and to stand in his strength. And may, at some point, we be able to be like Paul and stand in front of those who would kill him and say, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. May we declare it boldly, because that's the only solid ground which we can stand on. Amen. If you would turn to page 12 in your hymnal.